The world knew him as the Prince of Darkness, the Unchained frontman who helped invent heavy metal and lived a life so wild it became legend. She was the woman who took that chaos and gave it direction, who turned a rock star on the edge of self destruction into an icon who could fill stadiums for decades. From the moment they became a team, Ozzy and Sharon Osbourne were impossible to separate. They were partners in business, in family, and in survival. Together they navigated a life that swung between dizzying highs and near fatal lows. And through all of it, Ozzy never pretended he could have done it alone. Without her, I would be dead. Simple as that, he once said, not as a throwaway line, but as a truth he repeated over the years. It wasn't just a romantic sentiment, it was his reality. Sharon wasn't simply his wife, she was his shield, his strategist, his reality check, and more than once, the reason he was still breathing. Decades of touring, addiction, and public scandal had tested them both. There were stretches when their marriage was hanging by a thread, and stretches when it seemed unshakable. But no matter what the tabloids printed or how chaotic life became, they always found their way back to each other. And then came the final weeks. The noise faded, and there were no sold out arenas, no pyrotechnics, no reality TV crews chasing them through the house. There was only a husband and a wife sitting together with a lifetime of history between them. Ozzy, a man who had screamed into microphones over walls of sound, now spoke in a low, measured voice. Because what he needed to say didn't require volume, it required truth. This is the story of the final message Ozzy Osbourne wanted Sharon to hear. A message that was decades in the making, forged in chaos, sealed in loyalty, and spoken in the quiet when the world finally stopped listening. Before they were husband and wife, before they were business partners, before the world knew their names as one, they were just two people moving in the same orbit. The year was 1970 and Black Sabbath was on the rise. Ozzy was the voice of a sound that terrified parents and thrilled teenagers, a voice that seemed to come straight from the underworld. Sharon was still Sharon Arden, the daughter of Don Arden, one of the most feared and shrewd managers in the British music industry. The first time Sharon saw Ozzy perform, she was struck by the contradiction. Here was a man who didn't move like a traditional rock star. He didn't play it cool or calculated. He was unpredictable, twitching and pacing the stage like his body was a live wire and the music was the current running through it. I didn't think, oh, I'm going to marry him, she later admitted. I thought, God help whoever has to manage him. For much of the early 70s, Sharon's role was mostly behind the scenes. She was learning the family business from her father, negotiating contracts, booking shows, and smoothing over disasters. And when you were dealing with Black Sabbath, there were plenty of disasters. Ozzy was always at the center of the storm, charming one moment and impossible the next. He had the kind of magnetism that could make you laugh in one breath and want to strangle him in the next. By the late 70s, cracks had formed in Black Sabbath's foundation. Years of touring, drugs, and internal conflicts had taken their toll. In 1979, the breaking point came. Ozzy was fired from the band he had helped create. His drinking and drug use had spiraled so far out of control that even Sabbath, not exactly a group of choir boys themselves, couldn't keep going with him. Overnight, Ozzy went from fronting one of the biggest bands in the world to being written off as a burnout. It was in that moment, when almost everyone else had given up on him, that Sharon saw something no one else did. She knew the chaos was still there, but so was the magic. She'd watched him light up audiences. She'd seen how people leaned in when he spoke, how they chanted his name when the lights went down. She knew that the same energy that had gotten him into trouble could, if channeled, bring him back from the edge. That decision, to take a broken, unpredictable, and in many ways dangerous artist and try to rebuild him, wasn't just business, it was personal. Sharon didn't just see Ozzy as a client. She saw him as someone who could still be saved, someone worth saving. And whether either of them knew it then or not, it was the first step in a partnership that would change both of their lives forever. When Sharon took control of Ozzy's career in 1979, it wasn't a handoff. It was a rescue mission. The man she was taking on wasn't just between record deals, he was on the verge of self-destruction. His confidence was shattered, his finances were in ruins, and the industry had all but turned its back on him. For many, the story of Ozzy Osbourne seemed finished. Sharon was about to rewrite it. Her first move was brutal but necessary. Strip away the people who were enabling his worst habits. Ozzy didn't like it. Not at first. He resisted the structure, the rules, the deadlines. But Sharon knew he wouldn't survive without boundaries. She handled the contracts, booked the gigs, and made sure he was surrounded by musicians who could not only keep up with him on stage, but also keep him from collapsing off it. With a new band in place, Sharon launched Ozzy's solo career with the precision of a military campaign. The first album, Blizzard of Oz, wasn't just a comeback, it was a declaration of war on everyone who had written him off. Crazy Train blasted across radio stations, announcing to the world that the Prince of Darkness wasn't done. Not even close. Sharon also understood the power of an image. She leaned into the madness that made Ozzy unique, but she kept it just controlled enough to be marketable. She let him be wild on stage, but made sure every photo, every interview, every headline served the bigger plan. You can be mad as a hatter, she told him, but you have to be mad with purpose. It wasn't long before the metal world took notice. Ozzy went from forgotten to headlining festivals, selling out arenas, and drawing crowds as big as, if not bigger than, his Black Sabbath days. And behind every contract signed, every tour booked, and every deal made was Sharon, the woman who had bet everything on a man the world had counted out. Ozzy never forgot it. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, he would say later. And if you listen closely to those words, you can hear the foundation of what he would one day tell her in those final weeks. Words that began not in a hospital room, but in moments like this, when she put her own future on the line to save his. By the mid-1980s, Ozzy Osbourne had gone from being dismissed as a washed-up rock casualty to one of the most successful solo acts in heavy metal. With Sharon at the helm of his career, he was selling millions of albums, packing arenas, and reclaiming his place at the top of the music world. But the reality behind the curtain was far more complicated. Success didn't bring peace. It simply brought bigger stages for the chaos to play out. Their marriage, which began in 1982, was forged in constant motion. They raised their children in hotel rooms and on tour buses, grabbing family moments in the gaps between flights, rehearsals, and interviews. Ozzy's battles with addiction didn't end when the comeback began. They flared up often, sometimes threatening to undo everything they had built. Sharon's role stretched far beyond that of a manager. She was the anchor, the one holding the man, the brand, and the family together when the storms rolled in. In 2002, their world took an unexpected turn when MTV's The Osbournes launched, and what started as a quirky reality show became a cultural phenomenon. Millions tuned in to watch the chaos of their home life. Barking dogs, shouting matches, and Ozzy shuffling through the house in slippers. It was absurd, hilarious, and strangely relatable. But behind the humor, viewers saw something genuine. A couple bound together by a connection that had endured every kind of storm. That connection wasn't without its fractures. They endured public separations, deeply personal betrayals, and reconciliations that played out under a glaring spotlight. Each time they had the chance to walk away. Each time they chose to come back. Sharon later summed it up with a line that became a window into their bond. He's the love of my life. He drives me mad, but I can't imagine my life without him. The relationship wasn't a fairy tale. It was raw, messy, and real. They argued loudly, loved fiercely, and refused to let the other go, even in their worst moments. Theirs was a love built not on perfection but on survival, and survival forged a bond that no outsider could fully understand. That mix of madness, loyalty, and unshakable devotion became the foundation for everything that came later. And it was that foundation that gave weight to the words Ozzy would one day share with Sharon in the final weeks of their time together. Words shaped by decades of chaos, redemption, and the decision to never let go. For all the highs, Ozzy and Sharon's life together was equally defined by the lows. Some storms came from the outside, the endless scrutiny of the press, the grind of touring, and the pressure to keep the machine running. But many came from within, rooted in the struggles Ozzy carried long before he met her. Addiction was the most dangerous of these, and in the darkest periods it threatened not just his career but his life. Sharon often found herself in impossible situations. One day she was the business manager negotiating contracts. The next she was the caretaker keeping Ozzy alive after a bender. She later admitted that these moments weren't glamorous. They were exhausting, lonely, and sometimes terrifying. Yet walking away never felt like an option. She believed in the man behind the chaos, even when that belief was tested to the breaking point. In December 2003, a near-fatal ATV accident left Ozzy with a broken collarbone, 8 fractured ribs, and a damaged vertebra. For months, Sharon balanced her duties as his wife, manager, and nurse. Later came an even heavier blow, Ozzy's Parkinson's disease diagnosis. Publicly, he faced it with humor and grit. Privately, Sharon saw the toll it took on him. She shielded him when needed, but she never lied about the reality they faced together. Their marriage was also tested by betrayal. In 2016, news broke of Ozzy's affair and the fallout was brutal. Sharon left him, and for a time, it seemed final. I'm not proud of it, Ozzy admitted later, but I'm grateful she gave me another chance. The reconciliation wasn't quick or easy. It came only after counseling, rebuilding trust, and a shared decision that their history was worth more than their mistakes. Even in their professional life, battles emerged. Tours pushed Ozzy's health to the limit. Industry politics forced hard choices. There were moments when both of them questioned if it was worth the cost, and yet, the answer was always the same. They had been through too much to quit now. These storms, personal, physical, and emotional, didn't weaken their bond, and they forged it. Every crisis overcome, every scar earned, became part of a shared history no outsider could fully grasp. And it was that history that gave Ozzy's final words to Sharon in the last weeks of their time together a power that went far beyond sentiment. In the last chapter of their life together, the pace began to change. The constant touring slowed. The long haul flights, the grueling schedules, the back to back shows that had once defined their existence gave way to something quieter. For the first time in decades, Ozzy and Sharon could spend stretches of time at home, not because the industry wanted it, but because their bodies and their hearts needed it. Ozzy's health struggles became impossible to ignore. The Parkinson's diagnosis in 2019 had already shifted their priorities, but as the years passed, the disease added new challenges to even the smallest daily routines. There were good days when his humor shone through, when he'd crack a joke in the middle of a doctor's appointment just to see Sharon roll her eyes. But there were also days when he needed her for everything, and she was always there. They still made public appearances, often at award shows or music events, but they were no longer just about the spotlight. Every outing became a statement of unity. Fans would see them holding hands on a red carpet, and behind the flashbulbs, it was clear. They were leaning on each other in more ways than one. At home, life was simpler. Mornings meant coffee in the kitchen instead of early flights. Evenings meant family dinners instead of backstage catering. Sharon cherished the quiet moments, the ones that never made the tabloids. She once said, "The best thing now is just sitting with him, talking about nothing at all." For them, that nothing meant everything. They also looked back more often, revisiting old photos, retelling wild stories from the road, and laughing at the absurdity of the life they'd lived. The arguments over set lists and missed flights seemed smaller now. What mattered was the time they still had, and the memories they could still make. In these final years, their love took on a different shape. It was less about surviving chaos and more about protecting the peace they had fought so hard to find. And it was in this quieter space that Ozzy began to put together the words he would one day say to Sharon in the final weeks. Words shaped by every stage of their journey from madness to stillness. The final weeks of their time together didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement or a sudden shift. They came quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. The touring was long over, the interviews fewer, and the days were measured not in miles, traveled but in moments shared. Ozzy and Sharon were no longer running at the breakneck speed that had defined their early decades. They were living in the soft, slow rhythm of a couple who knew their time was precious. Friends and family noticed the change. There was a gentleness between them now, even in their teasing. Sharon became even more protective, managing who could visit and how much energy Ozzy had to spend. The home was calm, the chaos of their younger years replaced with the warmth of familiarity. The same voices, the same routines, the same comfort in each other's presence. The days took on a pattern. Mornings with coffee at the kitchen table, afternoons in the garden or on the porch, evenings with family gathered around. Sometimes they'd watch old concert footage, Sharon laughing at Ozzy's wild onstage antics, Ozzy grinning back and saying, "I can't believe I did half that stuff." Other times they would sit in silence, needing no words to understand what the other was feeling. In private, Ozzy began reflecting more openly. The man who had built a career on loudness found that the most important things could be said quietly. "I owe you everything," he told Sharon one evening, his voice low but steady. It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but the weight of it now was different. Final, in a way they both felt but didn't name. For Sharon, those weeks were a mix of gratitude and heartbreak. She knew the road they had traveled together better than anyone, and she understood what it meant for him to speak those words now. She held on to them, knowing they would echo long after the house fell silent. Those final weeks were not about endings as much as they were about holding on to every last moment. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word became a piece of something larger. a lifetime condensed into days, carrying them toward the conversation that would define the end of their story. It happened in the quiet, far away from cameras, crowds, and the noise that had defined most of their lives. There was no dramatic lead up, no audience to witness it, just the two of them, sitting together in the kind of stillness they had earned over 4 decades of surviving everything side by side. For once, Ozzy wasn't the rock star, and Sharon wasn't the manager. They were simply husband and wife. Ozzy had been thinking about this moment for weeks. The words weren't rehearsed, but they had been forming in his mind as he looked back over their life. Every high, every low, every night he almost didn't make it. She had been there. Every second chance he'd ever had was because she gave it to him, and now, in the final stretch, he wanted to make sure there was no doubt about how much that had meant. He took her hand, his grip weaker than it once was, but still steady. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. Sharon didn't rush him. She never did. Finally, he spoke. "Thank you for saving me. More times than I can count." His voice was rough, not from performance, but from the weight of truth. She squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. They had been through so much that words weren't always necessary, but these ones mattered. He went on. "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused you, and I love you more than anything. Always have, always will." It was simple, but it was everything. The chaos, the fights, the reconciliations, all of it distilled into a few sentences that carried the full history of their life together. For Sharon, this wasn't just a confession or a goodbye. It was the final piece of a lifelong conversation they had been having in fragments for decades. She didn't answer with a speech. She didn't need to. She just leaned closer, holding on to him as if to press those words into her memory forever. The world would never see this moment, but it was more important than any sold-out stadium or chart-topping album. This was the legacy Ozzy wanted to leave her. Not the music, not the fame, but the truth that in every way that mattered, she had been his entire world. When the moment finally came, it was as quiet as those last weeks had been. Ozzy passed, surrounded by family, with Sharon at his side, just as she had been from the very beginning. There was no grand stage or farewell tour curtain drop. The end was private, intimate, and deeply personal, a stark contrast to the noise and spectacle that had defined so much of his life. News of his passing spread quickly. Within hours, tributes began pouring in from fellow musicians, celebrities, and fans across the world. Rock legends called him a pioneer, younger artists spoke of his influence, and fans shared stories of how his music had carried them through their own storms. But for Sharon, those voices were distant echoes compared to the last words she had heard directly from him. The days after were a blur. Arrangements had to be made, calls had to be returned, statements had to be crafted. Sharon moved through it all with a calm that surprised even those closest to her. She wasn't cold or detached, she was focused. In her mind, the best way to honor him was to do what she had always done, protect him even now. When she finally addressed the public, her words were simple, steady, and full of gratitude. "He was my heart, my soulmate, and my greatest adventure," she said. "I was lucky enough to share my life with him, and I'll carry his love with me always." Those who knew her understood that she was speaking from the same place Ozzy had in those final weeks, from the part of their life that no one else could truly see. In the quiet moments at home, away from the cameras and condolences, Sharon would sit with a cup of tea and replay those last conversations in her mind. She didn't need to cling to recordings or videos. The words were burned into her memory. The apology, the gratitude, the love, they were hers alone, and they were enough. The world remembered Ozzy Osbourne for his voice, his madness, and his music. Sharon remembered him for the man who had looked her in the eye, taken her hand, and told her exactly what she meant to him. And that, above all, was the story she intended to carry forward. In the months after Ozzy's passing, the shock began to settle into something more lasting. The understanding that an era had truly ended. For fans, his voice lived on in records, videos, and the countless memories of live shows. For Sharon, his presence lingered in quieter ways, in the way the house still held his energy, in the stories their children told, and in the habits that hadn't yet faded from daily life. She knew from the beginning that protecting his legacy would be her responsibility. It wasn't about controlling the narrative for publicity. It was about making sure that the man behind the legend was remembered for who he really was. Complicated, flawed, but deeply human. She began working with their children to ensure his music, his business, and his image were were handled with care, just as he would have wanted. Publicly, she continued to show up at tribute concerts, award ceremonies, and charity events connected to causes they both cared about. Each appearance was a reminder that she was still carrying his name forward, not as a brand to be exploited, but as a story to be told honestly. His music changed the world, she said in one interview, but his love changed mine. At home, she kept certain things just as they were. His favorite chair stayed in its spot. His guitars remained on their stands. Friends said it was her way of keeping him close, but Sharon insisted it wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about acknowledging that some presences don't fade, even when the person is gone. The fans played their part in keeping him alive, too. Murals, tribute albums, online communities all served as proof that his impact was far larger than any single era or genre. Sharon often smiled at these tributes, knowing that Ozzy would have been both humbled and amused by the devotion. For Sharon, the legacy wasn't just about the music or the image, it was about the life they had built together, brick by brick, through storms and sunshine alike. And as long as she lived, she would make sure that story, their story, it was told in full. Ozzy Osbourne's story has been told in many ways, through the music that shook generations, the scandals that filled headlines, and the unforgettable chaos that defined his public image. But the story that mattered most to him was never about the noise. It was about the quiet moments, the ones shared with the woman who stood by him for more than 40 years, through storms that would have broken almost anyone else. From the first time Sharon saw him on stage in the early days of Black Sabbath to the final weeks they spent together in the stillness of their home, every chapter was marked by survival. They survived addiction, betrayal, illness, and the unrelenting demands of fame. They also survived the laughter, the ridiculousness, and the moments of pure joy that no camera could ever fully capture. The final words Ozzy left her weren't for the world. They were for her alone. Gratitude for saving him, apologies for the pain he had caused, declarations of love that carried the weight of a lifetime. These were not the words of a rock god speaking to a fan. They were the words of a husband to his wife, stripped of ego, fame, and performance. Sharon now carries those words like a promise. She continues to protect his music, his memory, and the truth of who he was. She knows the world will remember the Prince of Darkness, but she remembers the man who made her laugh in the middle of an argument, who whispered, "I love you," when he thought no one could hear, and who held her hand one last time to tell her exactly what she meant to him. For fans, his legacy is measured in riffs, lyrics, and the unforgettable image of a man who refused to be tamed. For Sharon, it's measured in the life they built together, messy, defiant, and real. And it's in the knowledge that even in his final moments, he was still fighting for them, still choosing them. In the end, the chaos faded, the lights dimmed, and the music stopped. But his voice remains, in the records, in the memories, and most of all, in the last words he gave to her.